all my weight, but most of it. Welcome back to our Green Thumb Gardening video series, especially this series on building soil. We've seen how double digging is extremely effective at the two key elements of soil building, adding organic matter and loosening the soil. It's extremely effective and intense. It's a lot of work. In fact, it might be a little bit too intense for some people. Plus, it's only really necessary for a few garden crops. Therefore, we need other methods that might not be quite as effective, but will work well enough for most people and most garden plants. Loosening the soil with a digging fork is just that method. Especially when it's combined with some hybrid options, it gets magnificent, if slightly lessened results. Can't wait to show you. Let's get going. First, clear the area of weeds, using a digging fork to pry them up as needed. If sod is present, remove it or smother it far enough in advance that it sufficiently degrades into the soil. If you have enough lead time, you have more options for the latter. For more information, check out our website for a post on dealing with sod. In this particular bed, we were dealing with a previous cover crop, so I mowed it really tight, tilled it in, and let it sit for a few weeks to several days. Now it's time for the heart of the method. Loosen the soil in the entire bed with a digging fork. This is as simple as it sounds, and is much like the initial loosening that takes place in the top of a double dug bed. Step the digging fork's tines entirely into the soil and pull back on the handle, lifting the soil slightly. Remove the fork and repeat the process a few inches behind, in front of, or adjacent to the previous spot, getting into a rhythm. Step, pull, step, pull, until you have an area big enough that you feel is ready for the next step. There will still be fist size or bigger clumps and clods at this point, but don't worry about them. They'll break up soon enough. If your soil is especially heavy or compacted, you'll typically need to repeat this process with the tines perpendicular to your first step before the next step. Once you've adequately pulled up a sufficient area of soil, typically just the soil close at hand, but some may want it to be the whole bed, further loosen it by simply stabbing the soil and moving the tines in all directions. It's during this step in the process that you'll notice how dramatically the soil is loosening, breaking up almost all larger clumps and clods and visibly fluffing up. Do this over the entire area. Trying not to step in this foot that steps down is just basically barely carrying my weight, keeping all my weight on my back foot. Don't step in the row. So, not all my weight, but most of it. Not easily. That fork is going that deep. It's a good sign. This is an old and wonderful practice that has been used among gardeners for centuries. My mother, on a recent visit, in helping me prepare the garden, loosening an area with a digging fork, recalled memories of her childhood of doing the same thing with her father. A spade can also be used. In fact, historically, this method was called spading. I recommend using a digging fork, however, and it's irreplaceable for the final twisting and pulling motion of loosening. Either way, this method loosens the soil much deeper than does tilling alone. With foot-long tines, a digging fork is able to loosen the soil 12 to 14 inches deep, providing the next best method to double digging, with only a moderate amount of work. Tillers, by contrast, with 6-inch tines only loosen the soil 6 to 8 inches deep, leaving a much harder layer just below this depth that can develop into a hardpan if too much compaction and only tilling takes place. This is the first of what will be 2 loosening sessions. The second, creating an especially loose and fluffy soil. One could wait to do this initial loosening until after adding the compost, but doing some initial loosening tends to make the final loosening and mixing much easier and is worth a relatively small initial effort. Add at least 2 inches of compost over the entire area. How much compost you add is entirely up to you and will likely depend on how much you think it's worth it. It's an individual choice, so far be it from me to prescribe any amount beyond 2 inches, but I will share our own experiences for context. We recently did 13 demonstration beds just so people could see the difference of plants growing in different soil preparation methods, and the bed with only 2 inches of compost added was among the lowest performers. A traditional double dug bed has 4 inches of compost added with 2 inches on each layer, so one could make the argument to be competitive with double digging, one needs to add at least that amount of compost. I've added as much as 6 inches of compost and have definitely noticed an increase health, and productivity for plants. For this bed, I got caught finishing in the dark, so I've included some video from another method just so you can see what a full 6 inches looks like. Again, the final choice is up to you, but if affordability is an issue, think about buying it in bulk. Local nurseries and landscape companies often have it available for from a third to a half of the price of what you can buy it bagged in the store. Call and ask around and you'll likely be amazed at the affordability of bulk compost in your area. What's better, it's delivered right to your home. However much compost you decide to use, once you've spread it evenly over the entire bed, it's time for the next step. Mix in the compost and naturally loosen the soil even further as you do so. Depending on how loose you made your soil in your first loosening, at first, you may need to use the same perpendicular and tine rocking methods that you used in the initial loosening step. But you'll be able to cover more ground with each insertion and pull and rock of the tines, since the soil is already relatively loose. Then, move on to the final loosening and fine mixing of the compost and soil by plunging the fork fully into the ground and twisting the tines while raising them. This thoroughly mixes the compost and loosens the soil, and you quickly feel and see both. You'll also notice that I'm very careful not to step on the bed so as not to compact it at all and undo the loosening I've worked so hard to create. You can test your soil's looseness along the way by merely dropping the fork into the soil from waist or shoulder height. If it completely buries the tines, it's almost as loose as you'll be able to get it. If you really do it well, soil can be made incredibly loose and fluffy with this final twisting mixing, competing with the texture of tilled soil, but loosened to a much greater depth. Repeat these steps for all the soil in the bed. Finally, shape the bed with a bow rake, making the sides gently sloping to minimize erosion and make planting easier. This example here is a 3-foot wide bed. If one watches closely in the previous steps, I also loosen the areas that will be paths. That's because another awesome option borrowed from the next method in the series is to pull up the loosened soil from the paths, adding it to the bed to increase its depth of loosened soil. This slight alteration of this method in a hybrid approach can end up giving loosened soil more than 2 feet deep in the center of the bed. Your tomatoes, peppers, and largest brassicas will love it. If your bed is on the edge of a garden or next to a garden path, the easiest way to do this is simply stand on one side of the bed and pull the soil onto it with a rake. If one does not already have an area in which to stand, however, without compacting freshly loosened soil, reaching in and attempting to make an initial path with a rake tends to be quite awkward, requiring strange, uncomfortable twisting motions and being fairly ineffective. Another option is to move your first path with a spade and use that path to rake the others. A spade is also nice for a final quick cleanup of a path. However you do your final mounding, you'll notice the mounded bed shown here, less than half done, is already quite tall, suggesting 2 things. Beds only 3 feet wide make for really high, steep-sided beds, and your plants will love the deeply loosened soil full of wonderfully rich organic matter. If you don't want such tall, steep-sided beds, make your beds closer to 5 feet wide or use temporary boards held by stakes to hold it in. There's more on both of these topics on the website. As for your plants loving it, the only plant that won't thrive in such a bed is possibly corn. They'll grow plenty well, but the soil's so loose they'll likely tip over in the wind. Otherwise, the rest of your plants will explode in growth and health. Enjoy it. And think about the lessons this teaches us about our plants needing deeply loosened soil, rich with organic matter. And just like that, you're finished. That's it for this episode. We hope this method gives you another wonderful option. And until next time, stay open to growing, especially the biggest green thumb secret of them all, growing your soil. And take care. And as always, check out our Twitter and Instagram. By the same token, check out our website for much more information on all of these topics. Not easily. That fork is going that deep. It's a good sign. It's a good sign and a good thing.